Ready?
Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Kiia Strömmer will defend the academic thesis Making Desirable Futures, Conceptualizing the Role of Future Making, Impact Investing and Social Entrepreneurship. I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Director, assessment committee, supervisors, friends and family, and colleagues here today. I'm very honored to be here today to defend my PhD thesis, indeed, Making Desirable Futures, Conceptualizing the Role of Future Making in Impact Investing and Social Entrepreneurship. So I started my study to better understand how there are these different engagements with the future that we see in everyday life. For example, we can see that many different organizations are setting up their net zero roadmaps or these global pathways on how they want to reach a certain goal. We also see that many different companies are setting up visions, for example, the vision for 2050, on how they are planning to reach a certain type of future. We also see that different organizations, for example, try to better understand what happens in the future. For example, here the World Economic Forum made a study on how the future of jobs may look like and try to understand different macro trends, for example, that could be happening. Also, for example, the European Commission sets up strategies, 2050 long-term strategy on how they are doing economic transition with sustainable finance. Or in more general terms, for example, there are these sustainable development goals set for the future. We see this happening in the organizational life, but also we can see that this phenomena has been picking up in research as well. For example, these concepts of future making and future imaginaries have been coming integral in organizational studies. A lot of different special issues and working groups set on studying how do organizations are making the future, or how in their everyday practices they are engaging with the future. Also, how do they imagine the future, or future imaginaries, which are these visions that they think about the future, and how do those visions affect their actions? Also different time horizons, for example, the near distant versus distant future, which refers to this not necessarily distance in time, but rather distance in understanding what type of future it might be. So what comes clear from this is that the way we imagine the future guides what we do today, but also that today's actions reshape the futures that we imagine. So I question, how do organizations and individuals assess, navigate, shape desirable futures? I started my research with a systematic literature review, which was focusing on forward-looking impact assessment. So in this study, I questioned how and why do organizations incorporate forward-looking, future-oriented approaches to impact assessment. So I went through all of the different articles that they are written about this phenomena and searched through different keywords when it comes to different words related to impact assessment, as well as keywords related to temporality, and especially this future-oriented temporality. From a keyword search, I found over 7,000 abstracts which are focusing on this phenomena, and from there I identified 178 articles that were explicitly focused on how organizations are indeed assessing impact in this future-oriented way. To get to my findings, we realized that there are many different antecedents that organizations have for engaging to understand impact in future-oriented way. For example, that they want to make decisions, they want to set goals, or explore what future might be, as well as different pressures that they may face. There are multiple different methods, for example, methods related to technology or scenarios, or for example, modeling, environmental modeling. There are also effects. For example, organizations can make decisions, be innovative, and learn, as well as share knowledge when they are engaging with impact in future-oriented way. From this systematic literature review, we realized that there are two specific arenas where impact is engaged in this future-oriented way. And these are impact investing and social entrepreneurship. So in both, actors are very much engaging with the future. So we decided to do two different data collections, interviews with both of these groups. So first, there were two different papers or two different research projects coming out of the impact investor interviews. Paper 2 focusing on how investors assess the future, and paper 3 focusing on how investors connect near and distant futures. So what is impact investing? Impact investing refers to this idea of mobilizing capital proactively, deliberately, and measurably to generate positive environmental or social impact alongside with financial returns. So the key here is that it is indeed proactive, deliberate, and measurable. So these investors, compared to traditional investors, when they are considering their financial risk and return, they also have to consider what is the future impact risk and return. So I conducted 40 different interviews with impact investors. I started my data collection with this organization called Impact Europe, which is a network or association with different European impact investors. I conducted these interviews to ask how do they make impact investment decisions, how do they assess impact, and how do they enact and think about the future. So then regarding coding, or analysis, I, for example, tried to see how do they engage with the future, how far into the future they're thinking, how do they connect their visions with the actions, and how do they, for example, define impact. So the paper 2 questions, how do impact investors use future-oriented impact assessment to understand and enact desirable futures? So what we found is that there are specifically these 3 different ways in which investors are engaging with impact assessment. So, for example, they ask more predictive methods of what will happen. For example, they are using impact forecasting. And then when it comes to more explorative methods, they ask what could happen. So, for example, more of these scenario-based analysis, and then also more normative engagement of what should happen. So, for example, setting an impact thesis or impact backcasting. Besides the formal methods, there are also more informal ways in which they engage with future. So the engagement with future is not always just assessment-based, but rather just also these ideas of the future that they may have, and that also affects their impact investing decision-making. So the overall, let's say, more higher level key takeaway here is that investors don't just predict future, they shape it by choosing which futures they want to support. Then when it comes to the paper 3, so also within the same interviews dataset, we question also how do investors navigate and connect distant futures and near future events. So in this paper, we were trying to understand how do investors kind of see the present as well as the images of the future. And what we found out is that sometimes investors, for example, only focused on present, so they don't necessarily go really far to the future. But for example, in our dataset, COVID-19 pandemic was very present, so some investors could only focus on the present activities and not really consider far into the future. Whereas we also noticed that some investors are rather just focused on the images of the future and not really connecting them to the present. So for example, they could be only talking about goals that they have for the future, but not really connecting that to the present or what should they do in the present or near future. We also saw that some investors are rather connecting these and using foresight methods to really consider from the present to the future what type of futures could we engender. Whereas others are rather focused on backcasting, so starting with different images of the future. So for example, setting a goal and then step by step considering from there how could we achieve this future. What was also interesting is that we saw that some investors were actually rather very much going from the present to the future and back. And what we call this as tempo oscillation. So really moving back and forth in their everyday activities, considering the near future practical constraints, but also the very big distant future goals that they have. So we saw here that investors move between different time horizons on what matters now, what matters later, and this helps them to keep more sustained focus on both immediate needs as well as the distant aspirations that they have. Then coming to the interviews with the social entrepreneurs, there was also 2 different research projects related to this. So what is social entrepreneurship? It is the process of identifying, developing and implementing innovative business venture to address pressing social, cultural and environmental issues. So the key here is that it is these social and cultural and environmental issues that are very much motivating and the reason for these entrepreneurs. So I did interviews with 40 different social entrepreneurs who were in the field of blockchain for good. So I started with this positive blockchain group, which includes entrepreneurs who are trying to use this technology for good. The methodology that I used was Dexter's ethnographic futures. So in these interviews, the focus was very much on the future imaginary. So how do they see what is the most desirable, undesirable, or likely, or their prediction of what would the future hold. And here, for example, I coded on what are they utopias, what are they dystopias, how do they, what type of societies are they picturing, what are their fears, how do they see the role of technology in this. Next, so the question that I had for the paper 4 was how do desirable and undesirable future imaginaries shape identities in nascent entrepreneurial fields? So I was very looking into what are their desirable futures and undesirable future imaginaries or utopias and dystopias. And what was interesting here is that they are very much connected. So what we found out is that, for example, a desirable future for one entrepreneur was to create a global government in which their technology would be the one ruling, but actually that was the most undesirable, or the dystopia then for others. And through here, the entrepreneurs were defining who they are and who they are not, who do they see as the coalition that they want to belong to. So the key higher level takeaway here is that one's utopia can be another's dystopia, so it's not just contested, but rather this dialect, and this shapes who they are and what do they see as good looks like. The paper 4, so another paper related to the social entrepreneur interviews, was how do future imaginaries motivate entrepreneurial action. And here the previous research has a lot of time focused on what was the antecedents for the entrepreneurship. So what the entrepreneurs thought that happened before is that they became entrepreneurs. But we also saw that futures can be the ones motivating them. So for example, expectations on what do they see likely, imaginaries, what could they create, as well as these narratives or stories that connect the today and tomorrow, or the expectations and imaginaries. So entrepreneurs don't just respond to the current conditions, but their actions can be guided by futures they believe are possible or future worth pursuing. So then it comes to my 5 key contributions with my study. So first, organizational futuring extends beyond predictions to actively shape desirable futures. So organizations don't just predict the future, but they are also actively working on them. Tempo oscillation connects future visions with present actions. So actors were able to move between, can indeed connect these aspirations to actions. Desirable and undesirable imaginaries play a dynamic and interconnected role in decision making. So both of these imaginaries affect how they think about the future and not just the desirability. Incorporating future-oriented tempo dimensions enables more holistic impact assessment. So understanding really the time and not only the retrospective or proactive impact measurement, but really truly engaging with temporality enables them to consider impact more, as well as future-oriented processes can help organization in fostering lasting impact and systemic change. Thank you, and I'll now give the word back to the program.
Thank you. The opposition will be started by Professor Dr. Harry Hummels, who was the chair of the assessment committee and who is a professor in corporate responsibility, impact investing, ethics and social entrepreneurship. The floor goes to Professor Hummels.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, let me first congratulate you with your PhD thesis. From where I stand, it's really an interesting and original thesis. And overall, it's very well structured and well written. And I actually look forward to your defense. You focus on, as you explained, how impact investors and social enterprises can contribute to the grand challenges of our times and to more sustainable futures using forward-looking impact assessments and other future-making instruments. That was, from an academic point of view, new to me, and it's really interesting to read that. But I would like to start my opposition with a quote that is attributed to the famous Danish physicist Niels Bohr. Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And yet, your thesis precisely aims to contribute to ways in which the future can be made more intelligible and how this intelligence can provide better guidance for our actions today and tomorrow. That is a serious and challenging endeavor and very relevant. But nevertheless, in the chapters 3 and 4, your papers on impact investing, you focus on a rather small group of 40 impact-driven investors who constitute a small fraction of Impact Europe. In the global impact investing market, with an estimated size of over 1.5 trillion US dollars, Impact Europe members chip in just over 26 billion, representing some 1.5% of global impact assets. Zooming out even a little bit more, the global impact investment market represents less than 1% of the total of global asset management, of the global asset management market. I do not want to sound cynical or critical. On the contrary, as Lao Tse remarked, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But it leads to 3 related questions. My first question is very simple. In this context, having researched the impact investors, the 40 impact investors, what is it that makes you think that the impact-driven investors can meaningfully contribute to tackling the grand challenges of our global society and our planet? This is followed by a more fundamental second question, namely, what constitutes a desirable future that impact investors aim to contribute to? Epistemologically speaking, no investor has knowledge of what future generations will value as meaningful and desirable. As a result, present generations of investors only take their own values, ideas, needs, and interests as a starting point and extrapolate these towards future generations. without ever knowing whether future generations would have made the same or a similar choice. Scenario planning provides an interesting example. Investors can develop several scenarios, but which scenario will ultimately come out on top is the result of geopolitical forces that are beyond the might of investors. So what constitutes that desirable future that impact investors aim to contribute to? And can they make a contribution? And third, even if investors were knowledgeable about the sustainability-related needs and the interest of future generations, they cannot know whether their current investments will contribute to resolving one or more grand challenges, aggravate these challenges, or cause new grand challenges. An example is provided by the current discussions on investments in nuclear energy. Would not be the best advice to investors be to refrain from investing in those assets that are proven to harm the interest of future investment and future generations? How would you respond to these challenges?
Many thanks you for the kind words that you gave. And thank you for the opportunity to highlight these aspects of the research, especially the quote. I feel like was very, very central to the thesis as well, especially in the paper 3 on how well these actors can indeed know the impact or know the future. It is impossible for any of us to predict at least the distant future. So coming to the first question, you asked how can these actors contribute to the being more sustainable world, for example. And I feel like from there is of course a question that it comes to if investing is for example one of these elements. But at least when it comes to the data set, we could see that there are a lot of new investors who are now deciding to focus on impact and making this impact investing actually then the normal investing, or that all of the investing should also consider this impact side. Then regarding the second question is that what constitutes desirable future? At least in the data set, we were really considering also kind of reflecting the social entrepreneurship side, is that it is often varying what do actors consider as desirable future. So also in the social entrepreneurship interviews, we realized that it is indeed that even the most desirable future can be the most undesirable future for someone else. And I could see that in the impact investing interviews as well. Even though they were all actors who were trying to create impact, there was very different ways that they were engaging with that. So how these actors at least were trying to really consider what is the more collective vision for the future. They were, for example, more engaging with participatory methods and considering with their investees of how can we indeed constitute a desirable future that also reflects the investees as well as the investors and also their own investors. Coming then to the third question, it is true that these investors, even though when they are trying to generate impact, they cannot necessarily know what type of future their investments can have. And we could see this in the interviews as well, that some of the investors, for example, talking about the mission drift that the organizations had, or that they had this idea that these entrepreneurs will be the ones generating the most impact. But that was not necessarily always the case. So I would say to that at least some of the investors were really engaging with this plural idea of the future, so really understanding that they cannot really know. So the only possibility is to then consider all the range of different possibilities that futures may happen.
Thank you. Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Rob Bauer, who was a member of the assessment committee and who is a professor in institutional investors and sustainable business culture and corporate regulation. Floor goes to Professor Bauer.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Kiia, first of all, sorry it took so much temporal oscillation to find a defense date. Sorry for that. I actually really enjoyed reading your thesis. Although the future occupies my mind quite often, and I like to think that I can sort of shape a small part of it, I had not realized that this was actually an academic field. This was new to me. So I learned a lot reading your thesis, and especially your literature review helped me understand this much better. But of course, I also have comments, and some of them I already gave in the first stage as feedback, and I really appreciated that you did so much reviewing that and also giving me exactly where you did the changes, so thank you very much. That really helps. So, of course, then my question is about something a bit different. That's the disadvantage of that. I have two questions. The first, so your key research question, if I re-paraphrase it a bit in chapter 3 is, how do impact investors use future-oriented impact assessment to understand and enact desirable futures? And you use indeed the EVPA, or now it's called Impact Europe, and you explain in your reply to me that this is the actors are foundations, charities, NGOs, family offices, sustainable asset managers, development finance institutions, pension funds and insurance companies. And you argue that these actors reflect the diversity, which I fully agree with, given the long list of European impact investing. But it also raises a trade-off, isn't it? You have a lot of diversity, so how can you compare them? And you have a lot of diversity, so how can you generalize them? And especially important is to realize that they enormously differ in duties, legal constraints they have, the risk perceptions they have, and how they interpret the word impact. Some of them will think this, real impact, as you also mentioned in your presentation, but while others just want to signal morality. I mean, some of these asset managers just want to signal, they don't care about the impact. I would at least suppose. So they also differ in their horizons. A pension fund has a long horizon of 60 to 80 years. Some of them even mention that in their mission statements, that they want to make the world a better place. I don't know whether you took a look at that. Whereas the asset managers have the next bonus horizon, at least, also in their compass. So, and some of them even don't invest, the people that you spoke to, I think, themselves. Maybe they have a role in the organization. I'm not 100% sure of that last part, so maybe you can clarify. So this means that they all interpret the future completely differently. And my first question, therefore, is also how this diversity affects any generalizability of your interview results. That's number one. And what alternative sampling methods might have helped address this if you could go back? Because now you did 5 studies and you have a lot of things that you learned. Then the second question, and I'll be short, Prorector. I'm intrigued by this textor ethnographic research. I had no clue. I would say this is anthropology, but probably it is. And I think if one sector needs anthropologists, it's the finance sector. I fully agree with that as well. But if I understand what you did in papers 4 and 5, you could also have done this with the impact investing interviewees. So you could also think about first order, second order, and even third order consequences in the eyes of textor. So what would be these first order effects and second order or even third order effects in the context of impact investing, if you would have done that?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for these questions, and also thank you for the comments in the assessment reports that were very, very helpful. Regarding the first question of the diversity of the data set, which I do agree that there is diverse actors included in the sample. So coming from the foundations to the asset managers, for-profit or not-for-profit, family offices. And I would say that this was an advantage in terms of studying the impact investing field and how the field itself engages with the impact investing, and especially the organization Impact Europe helped to kind of see that these organizations have at least some type of similar idea of for example, that they had workshops on how to do impact measurement. But I do agree that the diversity does give the trade-off as well. And I do see the point that maybe in another data collection, it could have been also helpful to only consider, for example, only consider asset managers for profit. This could have given more boundaries to the analysis as well, and how do they make these assessments. However, I would say that the diversity helped me to consider the field, but I would still say that the actors themselves are not too diverse. So for example, even the foundations, they were still making investments. So there was still an idea, for example, foundation was a foundational arm of a corporate, and the idea was to invest to entrepreneurs in their field of the corporation, or the asset managers, not for profit. For example, one was a asset managers whose biggest investor was a church. So even then, the idea was to invest to entrepreneurs in rural parts of Africa, for example. So still they were making investments. And that was the focus, to go through the investment process. But I do agree that it could have been more beneficial to also simplify this a bit for the sampling. And if I would do this again, I think for the studying impact investing field, it is important to consider these different actors. But I think I would have at least focused only on the asset managers for profit. I think that would have given me maybe slightly more generalizability of the findings regarding how are they making the assessments. Then regarding the third question of the textures, ethnographic futures, which is it's an interesting way of constructing the interviews as well, with the focusing on the desirable and undesirable and likely outcome. And even though this was not explicitly done in the impact investing interviews, there was some elements to it. For example, that we did ask what is their hopes, what do they think will happen within next 5 years, and from there I would say that it should be quite similar when it comes to the social entrepreneurship interviews. So I could see that some of these very desirable images were also undesirable for some. But at least one very clear desirable feature that most of these investors were talking about was that their field should become this normal, or all the investing should become impact investing. So that would be at least one of the very desirable features that investors would like to have.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Now we have two members of this degree committee online. The first one is Professor Dr. George Cook, who is a member of the assessment committee and whose professorship is in digital innovation entrepreneurship at the Manchester Metropolitan University. The floor goes to Professor Cook. I hope you can't see them as audience. I hope they...
Okay. Wider, for Momenta, highly esteemed candidate, Kiia Strömmer. I got two questions. The first one is theoretical related, and the second is methodologically related. My first question is more in terms of your theoretical positioning. Your dissertation takes desirable future as its point of departure. If you were instead to begin with mitigating undesirable future, do you think this shift in starting points could meaningfully alter the way your model is theorized? My first question is related more about some scholars will argue desirable and undesirable futures are subject to different temporalities. And so that brings me to my second questions, which is related to the method that you used. How you go about to ensure there's an appropriate balance between desirable and undesirable futures, especially when you draw on the dialectic lens? That's the two questions.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for these important questions. Regarding the first question of which I see very important, as well as that often when there is this idea of what's desirable, this also then reflects on what's undesirable, or how to mitigate the opposite. Especially in the paper number 4, so the paper focused on social entrepreneurship or blockchain entrepreneurs and the utopia-dystopia dialect. When we were asking the question of what is the most desirable future that you can think of, they actually sometimes did think about also mitigating the undesirability. So for example, when you are focused on, let's say, climate change, obviously then the vision that you have for the most desirable future reflects then that we don't want that future from happening. We don't want the, for example, specific levels of temperature rising. I don't think that it would necessarily change the results, because there was very much focused on the both sides of desirability and undesirability. Also, how I tried to avoid this was that with these interviews, there was equal amount of time used for both of the scenarios of the desirability and undesirability. So with the texture method, the idea is to have this order. So first, really focus on what's the goal that you want to have. Then, well, what's the opposite? What is that you don't want to, what you don't want happening? And then lastly, that they can have the chance to reflect what is their prediction. So I think that at least helped the actors themselves also to note the both scenarios and really consider what's the desirable and undesirable, even in the cases where they didn't necessarily have that explicitly laid out, for example, in their strategy documents. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Mirjam Foils, who was the last member of the assessment committee and who's particularly involved with organizational transitions to green and sustainable futures at Copenhagen Business School. The floor goes to Dr. Foils. Please unmute. Hopefully you can unmute, otherwise we've got a technical problem.
No? Okay.
There we are.
Okay. Dear candidate, I enjoyed reading your thesis, and that examines an important phenomenon, and that of assessing and shaping desirable futures. And the thesis highlights actually the relevant literature on time and temporality research, future making, and future studies. And given that this is the field I'm working in, I'm very intrigued by the thesis focus and excited also by its contributions to the studies of futures, including theories of anticipation, sociology of imagined futures, future studies, and future making and organizing, that you also all cite in your thesis. And while we have now already explored a little bit the connection between future studies and future making, with the other opponents, I would like to talk a little bit more about the temporality, because you use many different concepts, such as temporal work, temporal practices, temporal orientations, temporal tensions, temporal narratives, temporal commons, continuity and change, and of course also the main focus in your paper 3, temporal oscillation. So you briefly define all of them at the beginning of your thesis, but still I wondered a little bit where you would position yourself in this literature. What is the key concept you would like actually to work with and bring forward, and why? Or put differently, why does it matter? Why does temporality matter when we study future making? And my second question relates then more to how do you then approach this in practice? Because, you know, in the field of future making, and particularly the research on desirable futures, we have been debating a lot of how can we actually study something that is not yet there. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on this question in relation to your two studies. So maybe you could also take your research context into account to answer this question. So I'd like you to do, for the second question, to do two things: to reflect on your methodological choices, and second, to reflect on what specifically your cases may bring forward and how they can actually contribute maybe to the methodologies in future making.
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for the opportunity to highlight also the aspect of temporality literature in this thesis, which I see as very key. Especially, as you mentioned as well, the paper number 3 related to the temporal oscillation. I feel like there is a key contribution that could be made for wider temporality literature. Especially as I started with the temporal translation idea, and in the original model there is also consideration of the distant past and not only the distant future. Even though I only now studied the temporal oscillation when it comes to the future aspect, I do see that it would be important to also study the aspect of distant past. So also the past, of course, affect our ideas of what happened or how things went, affects how we are reconsidering the present. So in that terms, I feel like it would be important to also consider how do organizations temporal oscillate to the past and to the present and connect that in their everyday practices. When it comes to the second question on how to approach this regarding the methodology as well as the cases, I feel like there is interesting developments happening, like you mentioned, with regards to the organizational literature focused on future making, and I feel like there are two contributions that I could make from there. First, regarding the cases of the social entrepreneurship and impact investing, I would say that these fields are kind of these arenas for hyper-projectivity, where the future is very explicit in their actions when they are trying to contribute towards these different issues, for example. So that's why I feel like at least these two context of study could help us to understand that these actors who are engaging with sustainability are the ones who are also very much engaging with the future and bringing that to their actions. Also, I feel like there will be a methodological contribution, especially regarding the paper number 4 and slightly also 5 with the textures, ethnographic futures, research approach, and I feel like that is one way that we could study something that is not yet happened. So when going through these interviews, often the interviews were the arena where the entrepreneurs were first time them considering what's not necessarily the first time, but at least very explicitly thinking what is the most desirable or undesirable future that our organization is considering. So that created the place where these entrepreneurs were able to really consider the future and their impact thereby. And thus, I feel like this could be interesting to incorporate also in the context of corporations, for example, really giving them arena to think about, okay, what's the most undesirable or most desirable future that you could even imagine beyond just the goals or visions that these organizations have. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Abel Diaz-Gonzalez, whose expertise is in social entrepreneurship at this university. The floor goes to Dr. Abel Diaz-Gonzalez.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I have also enjoyed very much reading your dissertation, especially on my own academic interest on social entrepreneurship. I think it has a lot of contributions and it's also very futuristic in its own. I have a question about your temporal oscillation contribution, which appears to describe the movement between the near and long-term horizons in organizations. And you know very well that social enterprises are very much rooted in their context, but also in the way they acquire resources. So the question is, how do you think your model fundamentally differ from well-established constructs such as organizational ambidexterity, for example, or bricolage, and what is the conceptual contribution of this model that these theories will not bring? That's the first question. And my second question is related to your positioning of the model and the boundaries of your model. The empirical domains that you have studied or the groups are very much futuristic oriented. If you need to bring this model to study other type of ecosystem actors that are supporting social enterprises, for example, what part of your model will need some part of modifications when applied to these actors that normally they cannot freely shift between temporal horizons? What will be the difference, or could you generalize this model when applied to these ecosystem actors?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the opportunity to highlight these aspects, especially the past theories as well and their connections. I do see the idea that, for example, the organizational ambidexterity is somewhat similar to the idea of how much can we focus on the near future and how much to the distance. So how much can we exploit the current resources or explore future ones. How I see that the tempo oscillation is different is that when it comes to the distant future, it's not necessarily distance in just time, or let's say that the distance would be always 10 years from now, but rather just the distance in understanding. So something that cannot be derived from the now. So one easy example to consider this would be the net zero future, for example. So organizations can consider how much, when they are contributing towards the net zero goal, how much they are exploring or exploiting their resources. But when it comes to tempo oscillation, it's rather on how do they really consider something that is almost unknowable. So the distance in terms of that the net zero could be, let's say, for some very much in the near future, so they know the pathway to get there, they have ideas, but then the distance is rather that they don't necessarily even know how to get there, but they're still engaging with it, so rather that distance. And then considering how these arenas or these contexts that I studied, they are very much future-oriented, like you mentioned as well. These actors, when they are engaging with current challenges or sustainability, they are not only considering what we can do now, but very much thinking what we can achieve in the future, and especially in terms of how to create a future that we are part of. So in that sense, I do see the point that the models should be then changed when it comes to arenas that are not so future oriented. However, I do think that in some cases, for example, even organizations that don't necessarily are that much future-oriented, they do still have ideas of the future. So in that sense, then the engagement with the future is a bit more mundane or everyday actions when they're just considering, for example, goals for the next quarter or so forth. So even in cases that are not so hyper-projectivity is present, they are still engaging with future, but not necessarily in this predicting or assessment matter, but just more of a everyday future making level.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This concludes the first round and gives us an opportunity to move into a second round. Hopefully each with you with short questions. I'm happy to give the floor again to Professor Dr. Hummels.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, thank you for replying to our opposition. Don't know whether I'm completely convinced, but if you look back on your research process with the knowledge that you have today, and having heard the opposition of my esteemed colleagues and myself, would you do something different next time in terms of conceptual analysis, methodology, interview process, and a synthesis in terms of conclusions and reflection?
Thank you for the question, to highlight also learnings that I had from the research process. I think there are some things that I would, at least with what I know now, I would do some things differently. Well, first of all, how my research process started was that I was studying first just impact assessment side, and then from there we realized that actually these impact-oriented organizations are engaging with the future in different ways than just these formal methods or assessments that they have. And thus, we started the research with the systematic literature review on impact assessment methods and seeing all the literature that there is regarding this. So with the knowledge that I have now, I think it would be also important to start the research with literature review, also focusing on this rising field of future making or different future ways that the organizational literature is, especially since there are multiple new special issues coming up and standing working groups. I feel like there would be a need for a bit more an overview of the field itself. So that would be the first step. Other things that I would, which I reflected a bit already, is that with the impact investor interviews, if I would have given more boundaries to this sample, I feel like some of the findings could be more generalizable. However, I would still, with the idea to study the impact investing field, I feel like the diversity of actors was somewhat needed. But I feel like the studies could have benefited from these boundaries. Other things that I would do differently, I think one thing, because I had these two different data sets of the impact investors and entrepreneurs, I feel like since the impact investors are the ones who are investing often to the social entrepreneurs, I feel like there would have been a nice idea to study also the link between them. So for example, having the textures method applied to the impact investors as well, and I feel like that way we could better maybe see of how are they really truly making these decisions together or go building the future when both of the actors would have been compared as well. But besides that, of course, there's some small things. For example, engaging better with the documents as well of these actors will be very beneficial for future research. But with the limits of the thesis, I feel like the choices that I made were justified in that term.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Rob Bauer.
Yes, let's shift gear a bit. Could the Paronymph read out Proposition 9, please?
So Proposition 9 reads as follows. Imagining better futures is an act of responsibility, not optimism.
So I'm an optimist. Once in a while I'm responsible, probably. But don't we also need optimism to actually change something? So I just want you to explain what do you mean exactly with Proposition 9.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to highlight this proposition. I think the idea was not to necessarily say only that that optimism is not needed, but rather that it's not that it's necessary to think what will be the desirable future, and not only optimism. So I could also see this in the data, that especially the impact investors who were really truly considering the distant future, or these grand visions or grand challenges that they would like to contribute towards, those were the actors also who were at least explicitly understanding that their role in the future, as well as this plural concept of futures, that it's not just one future that they are predicting, or one future that they are trying to measure, but rather that there's plural choices. And that's why optimism, yes, it is needed, but it's more of an act of responsibility to really consider what's the goal that we would like to have, or what's the future that we definitely wouldn't want to have.
I could imagine that new technological developments, you need to have a certain stamina to go for it, and for that you also need some optimism, I guess, to get there in the first place. So I was just triggered by the not optimism, because you could have said not realism, not whatever ism. Why optimism? That was my question. Yes.
True. Well, I feel like it kind of came especially from also the social entrepreneurship interviews, and how these actors often had very, very optimistic ideas on their own role, as well as the role that the future that they would like to build, and that's why I decided to use the optimism.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm happy to give the floor once again to Professor Dr. George Cook, if you would like to, please.
Dear candidate, my question is related to the current debate on just transition. So how can your theoretical contribution be applied within the current debates on the just transition?
Yes, I feel like this is a important aspect, especially the just there. I feel like some of the actors that I was talking to were explicitly considering this, whereas others were not. I feel like my contributions can contribute towards this is this explicit understanding that there are plural futures, and not just one that we're measuring towards. And when actors are understanding that, I feel like there's more ways that we can understand then that also the impact that we're having is not only one actor working towards this, but rather that the future that we're building should be just for all of the different stakeholders, or all of the different actors within. So, for example, when considering the temporal oscillation concept, there is a possibility to use that to understand that the distant future is not just something that will happen, but rather that actors can build that rather together. And when there is this explicit understanding that we need to consider the future as well as the present, at least my results show that it seems to be a bit more easier for these actors to really truly consider also other actors who are building the future. Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Foyles, would you like to have another question, short one preferably, given the time available?
Okay, then I try to make it very short. You also mentioned the importance actually of lasting change. And first I wanted to reflect, or have you reflect on how do we ensure lasting change, and what do you mean actually with the concept? And if there's a little bit more time, what is then the role of continuity in this process?
Thank you. Yes, this was one of the key contributions indeed, to consider this idea of lasting change, and how especially actors who are engaging with the future can really consider the lasting change. So where this came from was the definition that I had for impact, kind of considering this distinction between having effects which are more immediate and outcomes, and then impact being a bit more long-lasting or even systemic. And in that regards, I feel like the lasting change really truly then connects to the distant future idea. So that, of course, we can make changes that would only happen in the near future. But when actors are able to consider also the distant or the effects that happen outside of them, or effects that happen outside of them from something that they can derive from the now, that can then engender more of the lasting change. However, there is still a bit of a question mark of if the impacts, for example, that these actors are having are truly lasting change, which I think will be very important also for future research to consider this aspect.
Hora asked.
You may briefly conclude your response, please.
Yes. So I think there should be more research also to understand how these actors then are actually able to really create this lasting change.
Okay, thank you. Kiia Strömmer, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company leave this room, and after the deliberation, the beadle will come and collect you and the audience to return to this room.
Nog een journalist of het gewoon sluit de voet erop. Interessant.
Use the whole space. Yeah?
Kiia Strömmer, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Kemp is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And Dr. Jared Ormiston will then later on do the laudatio for you. But I invite your supervisor now to take the floor.
You have to do the academic oath. So I will ask a question to you here, which is, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
Promise. Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Kiia Saara Katariina Strömmer, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of this university. And I also should add that you also get the diploma from the what is it? The technology. University of Technology in Sydney. So congratulations with that. First of all, congratulations.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm now happy to give the floor to Dr. Jared Ormiston from the University of Technology, Sydney. All goes to Dr. Ormiston.
Thank you. It is my absolute honour to deliver this laudatio for the newly minted Dr. Kiia Strömmer. I've had the pleasure of supervising Kiia on her doctoral journey as her daily supervisor at Maastricht University and also her primary supervisor at the University of Technology, Sydney. From our earliest interactions, Kia's shown her hustle mentality from applying for internal funding with Renee and I to assisting, cobbling together funding from different Finnish funding bodies. It's been clear to me from our initial conversation that Kiia was passionate about embarking on a research journey and also incredibly entrepreneurial in making it happen. A strong early memory of mine about Kiia and her work ethic was at a writing retreat that we ran in the Ardennes with Kiia and Wiebke and Renee and Mel. It was a structured 3-day writing program. You know, we were goal setting for every 2-hour writing block. And at the end of each block, we went around the table, reflected on our progress. All of us would talk about getting sidetracked, hitting roadblocks as we muddled through our work. Yet without fail, every single time, Kiia would humbly share that she'd reached her goal and was ready to move on to the next one. Really, this ability to set clear goals, hold herself accountable, has served her very well in what can only be described as a nomadic PhD experience. Kiia truly did embrace the opportunities afforded by being an externally funded PhD by distance. I know that during the second half of Kia's PhD, I've basically given up trying to know which country she's even in. We've had Zoom calls in every possible time zone, Kia's background shifting from random Airbnbs to co-working spaces in every continent. But rather than this leading to a sense of disconnection or isolation, Kia's turned this into a world of opportunity. And I was, and I still am, constantly surprised by the connections Kiia makes in both the academic and practitioner worlds. So we've had a lot of these, online conversation, but Kia's engagement in a range of academic communities has meant that we've had some really lovely, these very meaningful, more exploratory conversations at academic conferences every summer. Kia's really embraced and embedded herself in a range of academic communities that I think will continue to serve her on her journey. She's very transdisciplinary, as I was sharing with others. She's into the world of social entrepreneurship, management organization studies, impact investing, future studies, and some more niche communities at EGOS around sort of temporality and future making. But it's been really wonderful to see Kia's confidence grow further and further over these last few years. She's presented and defended her work in front of senior scholars from a range of fields. And as we saw today, it's hard to do, right? This, it was a robust defense. It's no easy task. So I think putting yourself up there in front of a range of scholars is really wonderful to see. So, we've got to enjoy the, Kia's sort of zeal for the global nature of academia means we've got to have some lovely conversations in some special settings, fancy dinners and craft beers in Helsinki, red wine on the city steps in Sardinia, tapas in Teruel, giant schnitzels in basements in Viennetta with Vibka, poolside cocktails on the outskirts of the Athenian coast to Asian fusion overlooking the cityscape of Sydney. Kiia really did make a strong impression on everyone at the Transdisciplinary School when she visited Sydney last year. And I think those connections with Sydney and Australia will further continue as she expands her academic collaborations. Wonderful to see Eric there. And, it's also been super interesting to see Kia's work alongside Eric as a real example of putting her research directly into practice. It's rare that we get to see the immediate impact of our research. And I really think Kiia is sort of reimagining how we might speed up our processes of research translation. I'm constantly amazed at how Kiia can juggle all these different commitments. She really is one of the most efficient and calm folks in the academic world, never put off by ridiculously short deadlines, crazy ideas. Her persistence and efficiency that was there in those early conversations has really continued throughout the PhD. And I think that ability to juggle practice, academia, and life will really hold Kiia in good stead as she continues on this journey of combining academia and practice. So important to say, Kiia is the first graduate of the collaborative doctoral degree program between Maastricht University and the University of Technology, Sydney. And I think Kiia has now completed the feat that I think we need to call it the academic triple-double. So 2 bachelor degrees, 1 from Finland, 1 from the Netherlands, 2 masters, 1 from Italy, 1 from Sweden, and now two PhD testimonials, 1 from the Netherlands, 1 from Australia. I assume we're going to see dual appointments will be a theme of Kia's career. Looking forward to seeing the overcrowded wall in Kia's Zoom background when she finally lands a more permanent office. Enjoy your celebrations today with family and friends. We're all very eager to see what you achieve in both the near and distant future. Cheers.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks a lot, Jared. Dear Dr. Strömmer, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family and friends, and your supervisors with the degree you have acquired, and I would like to thank the members of the degree committee for their contribution. And then we would like to make some pictures, preferably can also be done with the family, because if you keep seated, then we will stand here so that we have in the background, both the co-supervisor, Jared Ormiston, Professor Cook, Dr. Turls, and then we can later on make a picture on the main stairs in this building, which is a custom which we would like to continue. With this, I'm not yet closing it, because let me first give the 2 degree committee members, Professor Cook and Dr. Foyles, an opportunity to congratulate you, because now is the chance to do so.
I suppose now I have to say, well, may I first congratulate you for undertaking a dissertation on such a timely, important topic. I hope you will continue this research journey and keep contributing to this emerging field. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Voits?
Yeah, huge congratulations from my side. I had the pleasure of meeting you already and discussing your work at different conferences, and I always enjoyed our conversations very much. So huge congrats on the doctorate, and I hope I will have the chance to follow where this is going. As Jared mentioned, your work is truly transdisciplinary. This comes with many challenges, but you have taken them on wonderfully. And I think your contributions have many, many gems in them, like temporal ethical paradoxes is, for instance, one I would love to see you explore further. And I look forward to continuing the conversations with you. Huge congrats.
Thank you. Please stay online so that you will be on the picture. If you see us leaving this room, you can do whatever you want and enjoy the day after your contribution. Thank you very much. I close this session.
Please all rise and maybe